April 1945. A group of German women auxiliaries stood trembling before American soldiers, expecting the worst horrors of war, when ordered to undress for medical inspection. They braced for brutality they'd heard about from the Eastern Front. What happened next would shatter everything Nazi propaganda had taught them about their enemies. January 1945 marked the beginning of the greatest mass flight in European history. As Soviet forces crossed into German territory for the first time since Operation Barbarossa, millions of German civilians abandoned their homes and fled westward. They weren't running from abstract military defeat. They were running from documented atrocities that had already begun in the border regions of East Prussia. The massacre at Nemmersdorf in October 1944 had sent shockwaves through Germany. When German forces briefly retook the village, they found scenes that Nazi propagandists barely needed to embellish. Civilians had been murdered, women violated, children killed. The Soviet forces had withdrawn, but the message was clear. This would be a war of revenge, and the German people would pay for what their army had done in Russia. Wehrmacht intelligence reports documented the pattern repeating across dozens of villages. Soviet forces advancing into German territory were not operating under the same restraints that governed Western Allied armies. Officers who tried to prevent atrocities were often ignored. Soldiers who had seen their own villages burned, their families killed by German forces during the invasion of the Soviet Union, now took vengeance on German civilians. The Red Army command structure, while officially forbidding such acts, did little to prevent them in practice. Nazi propaganda seized on these incidents, but for once they didn't need to lie. The Eastern Front had become a nightmare, and every German who could manage it tried desperately to reach American or British lines instead of falling into Soviet hands. The propaganda machine did add one crucial falsehood, though. It claimed the Western Allies would be just as brutal, that all enemies of the Reich were Bolsheviks at heart, that capture by any Allied force meant certain death or worse. By April 1945, the situation was chaotic. Germany was collapsing from both directions. In the east, Soviet forces pushed toward Berlin with overwhelming numbers. In the west, American and British armies crossed the Rhine and drove deep into German territory. Between these converging forces, millions of German soldiers and civilians tried desperately to position themselves to surrender to the Western Allies rather than the Soviets. Among those fleeing east to west was a group of 40 women from the Luftwaffe auxiliary services, the Nachrichtenfelfen, communications helpers. These weren't combat soldiers, but they wore uniforms and served in military installations. Under Nazi Germany's total war mobilization, approximately 500,000 women had been recruited into such auxiliary roles. They operated radios, tracked aircraft, worked in headquarters facilities, and performed countless other tasks that freed men for combat duty. Greta Lindemann was 27 years old and had served as a radio operator for almost 3 years. Her unit had been stationed in Silesia, in what was now Poland, operating communications equipment for Luftwaffe fighter control. As Soviet forces advanced in January, the order came to evacuate. What followed was weeks of chaotic retreat, moving westward through increasingly disorganized German defensive lines, watching the Reich collapse around them. The group of women traveled with a mixed column of refugees and retreating soldiers. They'd abandoned their vehicles when fuel ran out, abandoned their equipment when it became too heavy to carry, abandoned everything except the desperate hope of reaching American lines. Along the way they heard stories from other refugees, from wounded soldiers, from anyone who'd been near the Eastern Front. The stories were remarkably consistent. Soviet forces were taking revenge for 4 years of German atrocities in Russia. Greta had seen some of it herself. Her unit had attempted to evacuate through a village the Soviets had already passed through. The scenes there would stay with her forever. Bodies in the street, buildings burned, evidence of systematic violence. 2 women from a neighboring auxiliary unit who'd been caught by Soviet forward elements and hadn't survived the encounter. The message was unmistakable. German women in uniform could expect no mercy from an enemy whose country Germany had devastated. By late April, Greta's group had made it into Bavaria. They were exhausted, hungry, and traumatized, but they were west of the Soviet advance. American forces had taken this region. On April 25th, near the city of Regensburg, they made contact with elements of the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division. The actual moment of surrender was almost anticlimactic. They approached an American checkpoint on a rural road, hands raised, calling out the few English words they knew. The American soldiers were professional and cautious. They searched the group for weapons, separated the handful of male soldiers from the women, and called for an officer. Within an hour, the entire group was being transported to a temporary POW processing facility. The facility was a collection of tents erected in a field near a small town. Thousands of German prisoners were being processed daily as the Wehrmacht disintegrated. The Americans had established an efficient system. Prisoners arrived, were searched, registered, given basic medical screening, and then transported to permanent POW camps. The entire U.S. military infrastructure had adapted to handling massive numbers of prisoners while maintaining the standards required by the Geneva Convention. Greta and her group were placed in a holding area, separated from male prisoners by a fence and considerable distance. This itself was surprising. They'd been told by propaganda that the Americans would treat them like the Soviets did, that capture by any enemy meant certain violation and likely death. Instead, American soldiers brought water and distributed rations. The soldiers were, matter of fact, neither friendly nor hostile, simply processing another batch of POWs among thousands. Several hours passed. The women sat in the holding area, trying to understand what was happening. The Americans weren't hurting them. They'd been given food and water. Guards stood at a distance, not interacting unnecessarily. It was all very bureaucratic and organized. Greta felt a cognitive dissonance building. This wasn't what she'd expected. Nazi propaganda had insisted the Americans were as barbaric as the Soviets, just better at hiding it. When would the real treatment begin? Late in the afternoon, new personnel arrived. These were women in American uniforms, members of the Women's Army Corps. Among them was Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, a 32-year-old nurse from Illinois who'd been assigned to process female POWs. She'd seen dozens of such groups over the past weeks. German women, auxiliaries, nurses, even some female concentration camp. Her job was to conduct medical screening, ensure they weren't carrying diseases that could spread through POW camps, check for injuries that needed treatment, and complete the documentation required for proper POW registration. An interpreter accompanied the medical team, a German-American corporal who spoke both languages fluently. He called the women to attention and explained the next step in crisp German. They would undergo medical examination. This was standard procedure for all prisoners. It was necessary to check for typhus, dysentery, other diseases. It was necessary to ensure they had no hidden weapons. It was necessary to document their physical condition upon capture. Then came the instruction that triggered panic. They would need to remove their clothing for the examination. They would be given clean clothes afterward. The examination would be conducted by female medical personnel. Everything would be done according to proper medical procedure. Greta felt her stomach drop. This was it. This was when the facade of civilized treatment would end. She'd heard too many stories from the East, too many accounts of what happened when women were ordered to undress by enemy soldiers. The clinical language about medical examination was obviously a pretense. This was how it would start. Around her, the other women reacted with visible terror. Some began crying. Others froze in place. Several started praying. They all understood what was coming, or thought they did. Nazi propaganda had prepared them for this moment. The Americans would reveal themselves to be no different from the Soviets. The violation would begin. Some of the women had already decided they would resist, would rather be shot than submit. Others had already resigned themselves to survival at any cost. Greta made a decision. She was the oldest, the most senior in rank, and had served the longest. If this horror was inevitable, she could at least try to protect the younger one. She stepped forward and addressed the interpreter in broken but understandable German-accented English. "Take me first. Do what you want with me. Please leave the others alone. I'm an officer. I'm responsible for them." The interpreter looked confused. He translated her statement to Lieutenant Mitchell. The nurse's expression shifted from professional neutrality to concern, and then to understanding. She'd seen this reaction before, though never quite so dramatically. These women thought they were about to be assaulted. They had no concept of actual medical procedure conducted by professional military personnel following regulations. Lieutenant Mitchell spoke through the interpreter, her tone firm but not unkind. "Nobody is going to hurt you. This is a medical examination. It will be conducted by nurses. It's the same examination we give to all prisoners to protect everyone's health. You'll be treated with dignity and according to military medical protocols." Greta didn't believe her. How could she? Everything in her experience, everything she'd been told, everything she'd seen, suggested this was a lie meant to secure compliance. She repeated her offer to go first, to be the sacrifice that might spare the others. Lieutenant Mitchell sighed and made a decision. "Fine, you first. Come with me. You'll see this is exactly what I said it is. Greta walked toward the medical tent as if walking to her execution. Her heart pounded, her hands shook. She was terrified but determined not to show it, not to give her enemies the satisfaction. Behind her, the other women watched in helpless horror, certain they were witnessing their leader being taken to brutalization. Inside the medical tent, Greta found herself facing 2 WAC nurses and Lieutenant Mitchell, no male soldiers. The interpreter stood near the entrance. The nurses gestured for her to remove her uniform. Greta closed her eyes and complied, trying to detach mentally from what was about to happen. Nothing happened. Instead, one nurse began a systematic visual examination, checking her skin for signs of disease. The other nurse took notes on a medical form. Lieutenant Mitchell explained each step through the interpreter. They were checking for typhus symptoms, for lice, for scabies, for injuries that needed treatment. They checked her hair, her skin, looked in her mouth, examined her hands and feet. Then came the DDT powder. The U.S. military had adopted dichlorodiphenyltrichloroethane as standard delousing agent. One nurse applied the white powder to Greta's hair and body, paying particular attention to areas where lice typically lived. The powder felt strange, but not painful. The nurse explained it would kill any parasites and prevent typhus transmission. After the DDT application, they provided a clean POW uniform, standard issue for female prisoners. It was rough fabric, but clean, far cleaner than the filthy uniform she'd worn for weeks of retreat. They gave her documentation, a POW identification card with her name, rank, and capture date. They asked about injuries or illness. When she said she was healthy except for exhaustion, they noted that and cleared her for transport to a POW facility. The entire process took perhaps 20 minutes. It was clinical, professional, and utterly impersonal. Nobody had touched her inappropriately. Nobody had threatened her. Nobody had done anything except conduct a standard medical screening exactly as Lieutenant Mitchell had promised. Greta stood outside the medical tent in her new, clean uniform, holding her POW documentation, trying to process what had just happened, or rather, what hadn't happened. She'd been prepared for horror and instead experienced bureaucracy. She'd expected violation and received medical procedure. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Lieutenant Mitchell emerged and spoke through the interpreter. You can tell the others it's exactly the same process. We're going to process them in groups of 5. It will go faster that way. They'll all be checked, deloused, given clean clothes, and registered. Then you'll all be transported to a women's POW facility where you'll be held for the duration of the war. Greta walked back to the holding area in a daze. The other women surrounded her immediately, desperate to know what had happened. She tried to explain but couldn't find adequate words. They didn't hurt me. They just examined me. Medical examination. They gave me clean clothes. They were professional. It was just procedure. The women didn't believe her initially. They thought she was in shock, lying to protect them or being forced to lie by the Americans. Only when the next group went through the same process and returned with the same story did acceptance begin to spread. The Americans weren't going to brutalize them. This was actual medical screening, exactly as claimed. Over the next several hours, all 40 women were processed through the medical screening. Each received the same professional, impersonal treatment. Each emerged confused and shaken not by what had happened, but by what hadn't happened. Nazi propaganda had prepared them for American brutality. The reality of American military procedure operating according to international law was something they had no framework to understand. By evening, they were loaded onto trucks for transport to a permanent facility. During the drive, conversations began tentatively. The women tried to reconcile propaganda with experience. Some suggested this was temporary, that the real abuse would start later. Others wondered if the Americans were simply different from the Soviets. A few, including Greta, began to question everything they'd been told about the Allies. The women's POW facility was located near Munich, established specifically for female prisoners including military auxiliaries, nurses, and others captured during Germany's collapse. It consisted of wooden barracks surrounded by wire fencing, guard towers at the corners, and administrative buildings. Approximately 300 German women were already housed there when Greta's group arrived. The conditions were basic but adequate. Each woman received a bunk with blankets, access to washing facilities, regular meals, and medical care. The food was simple but sufficient, certainly more than most Germans were eating in the collapsing Reich. Prisoners were assigned work details as permitted under the Geneva Convention, primarily kitchen duty, laundry, and agricultural labor in nearby fields. More surprising was the absence of abuse. Guards maintained professional distance. Male personnel didn't interact unnecessarily with female prisoners. Discipline was maintained through regulations and consequences like reduced privileges, not through violence. The entire facility operated according to documented procedures that prisoners could learn and understand. Greta spent the first week in a state of continued cognitive dissonance. Everything she'd been taught suggested this treatment was impossible. The Allies were supposed to be monsters bent on Germany's destruction. Instead, she was experiencing treatment that, while certainly imprisonment, was humane and regulated. She had 3 meals daily, medical care, shelter, safety. She wasn't being worked to death, starved, or subjected to random violence. Other prisoners shared information that deepened her confusion. Some women had been captured months earlier and reported consistent treatment throughout. Some had received letters from family through the International Red Cross. The Americans actually followed the Geneva Convention requirement to allow POW correspondence. Some prisoners had even received Red Cross parcels with small luxuries like chocolate and cigarettes. The realization came gradually. The Americans weren't operating like the Soviets because they weren't like the Soviets. They represented a fundamentally different approach to warfare. They maintained standards even when fighting an enemy that had abandoned those standards. They followed international law even when it was inconvenient. They treated prisoners humanely not because those prisoners deserved it, but because the Americans believed civilized nations must behave in civilized ways even during total war. This realization was uncomfortable for Greta and many others. If the Americans maintained moral standards while fighting Germany, what did that say about Germany's own behavior? Greta had heard rumors about concentration camps, about treatment of Soviet POWs, about actions taken in occupied territories. She dismissed these as enemy propaganda. Now she wondered if she'd been wrong. The women's camp received newspapers, carefully censored, but containing basic information about the war's progress. In early May, news arrived that Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Hitler was dead. The Nazi regime had collapsed completely. For the prisoners, this meant their status shifted from wartime post to post-war detainees awaiting repatriation. During this period, more information began to filter through. The liberation of concentration camps, photographs of Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald, documentation of systematic murder on an industrial scale, evidence of atrocities committed by German forces across Europe. The extent of Nazi crimes became undeniable, even to those who'd tried to avoid knowing. Greta struggled with this information. She'd served the regime, worn its uniform, followed its orders. She hadn't personally committed atrocities, but she'd been part of the system that enabled them. The Americans who'd treated her with professional distance rather than vengeance had every moral right to be far harsher. Their restraint was itself an indictment of everything the regime had represented. Some prisoners in the camp became defensive, refusing to believe the evidence of Nazi crimes. Others fell into depression or denial. Greta chose a different path. She decided to understand what had actually happened, to confront the truth about the regime she'd served, and to figure out how she'd been so thoroughly deceived by propaganda. Conversations with other prisoners revealed a pattern. Many had similar experiences to Greta's. They'd expected brutality from American captivity based on propaganda that insisted the Allies were as barbaric as Nazi Germany. The reality of professional military procedure following international law had been shocking, but this contrast raised troubling questions. If Nazi propaganda had lied about Allied treatment of POWs, what else had it lied about? The camp administration initiated denazification programs. Prisoners attended mandatory educational sessions about Nazi crimes, about concentration camps, about the regime's actual ideology and actions. Many prisoners resisted initially, dismissing it as Victor's propaganda, but the evidence was overwhelming and carefully documented. Survivors testified. Photographs showed undeniable reality. Documents captured from German government offices proved systematic planning of atrocities. Greta attended these sessions and found herself convinced despite her initial skepticism. The evidence was simply too substantial to dismiss. The regime she'd served had committed horrors beyond her previous imagination. The war Germany had started had killed tens of millions. The systematic murder of Jews, Slavs, Roma, disabled people, political opponents, and others had been official government policy, not isolated incidents or exaggerated propaganda. Understanding this created a moral crisis. She'd been on the wrong side. She'd served evil while thinking she served her country. The Americans who'd captured her had been the actual defenders of civilization, while Germany had represented barbarism. The professional restraint American personnel showed toward German prisoners was moral courage she hadn't possessed herself. Some prisoners in the camp had been captured by Soviets and later transferred to American custody. Their stories provided stark contrast. Soviet POW camps operated under different principles. Food was scarce, conditions harsh, forced labor brutal, sexual assault was common. Survival rates were much lower. German POWs held by the Soviets died in huge numbers, approximately 1 million out of 3 million captured. This created complicated feelings for Greta. She felt grateful for American capture while recognizing that Soviet brutality was, in significant part, retaliation for German treatment of Soviet POWs. Germany had captured approximately 5.7 million Soviet soldiers during the war. Of these, 3.3 million had died in German captivity, a 57% mortality rate. They'd been deliberately starved, worked to death, executed, or allowed to die of disease. Nazi ideology viewed Slavs as subhuman and treated Soviet prisoners accordingly. The Americans knew about German treatment of Soviet POWs. They knew about concentration camps. They knew about massacres in occupied territories. Yet they still treated German prisoners according to Geneva Convention standards. This moral restraint in the face of enemy atrocities was something Greta had never witnessed from her own side. Statistics told the story clearly. Of approximately 380,000 German POWs held by the United States, fewer than 1% died in captivity. Most deaths resulted from injuries sustained before capture or diseases caught before detention. The survival rate exceeded 99%. By contrast, German POW camps for Soviets had a 57% mortality rate, and Soviet camps for Germans had approximately 35% mortality rate. The differential treatment wasn't accidental. It reflected fundamentally different approaches to warfare and different underlying values. The United States maintained POW treatment standards because American military culture valued law and procedure, because reciprocity with other Western nations was important, and because American ideology claimed moral superiority that required proof through action. Lieutenant Mitchell visited the camp several times during the summer of 1945, checking on medical conditions and POW welfare. During one visit, Greta requested to speak with her through an interpreter. Mitchell agreed, curious about the woman who'd offered herself as a sacrifice to protect others. Greta struggled to express what she wanted to say. She thanked Lieutenant Mitchell for professional treatment. She apologized for not understanding American intentions during the initial medical screening. She tried to explain the propaganda and expectations that had shaped her reaction. Lieutenant Mitchell listened and then responded simply, "We're not the Soviets. We follow rules. We maintain standards. Not because captured Germans deserve it, but because we believe civilized nations must behave in civilized ways. That's what separates us from the Nazis. That's what we were fighting for." The conversation lasted only minutes but crystallized something for Greta. American restraint wasn't weakness or naivety. It was strength. It was proof that democracy could wage total war without abandoning the values that made it worth defending. Nazi Germany had abandoned any pretense of civilized behavior and justified atrocities as necessary for survival. America had maintained moral standards while defeating enemies who'd abandoned those standards. Repatriation began in late 1945 and continued through 1946. POWs were gradually released and sent back to occupied Germany. Priority went to those with families, to those with needed skills, to those who completed denazification screening. Greta was released in March 1946, almost a year after her capture. She returned to a Germany that no longer existed. The Third Reich was gone. The country was divided into occupation zones. Cities were destroyed. The economy was shattered. Millions were dead. The scope of Nazi crimes was now undeniable public knowledge. Former party members faced legal consequences. Former soldiers struggled with guilt and trauma. The entire nation had to rebuild physically and morally. Greta settled in the British occupation zone, in what remained of Hamburg. She found work eventually, trained as a teacher, built a quiet post-war life. She rarely discussed her military service or POW experience. The war had taught her lessons she spent decades processing. The undressing order that had terrified her in April 1945 became a kind of symbol in her memory. That moment of absolute terror, expecting violation and experiencing instead professional medical procedure, represented the collapse of propaganda and the confrontation with reality. She'd been taught that the Allies were monsters. She'd discovered they were professionals following regulations. That single moment had begun her ideological transformation. The broader lesson took years to fully understand. Civilizations prove themselves not just through military victory, but through restraint during conflict. The Americans had won the war while maintaining moral standards that Nazi Germany had abandoned. They'd treated prisoners humanely, despite knowing about German atrocities. They'd followed international law when it would have been easier not to. That restraint demonstrated strength of character that military power alone couldn't show. The Eastern Front provided the counterexample. Soviet treatment of German POWs was brutal, but it was brutal in retaliation for German brutality in the Soviet Union. The cycle of atrocity and counter-atrocity demonstrated what happens when civilized restraints collapse. The Americans had broken that cycle by refusing to reciprocate German brutality, by maintaining standards even when fighting an enemy that had no standards. For Greta, personally, the experience shaped her understanding of propaganda and truth. She'd believe Nazi claims about Allied barbarism because those claims fit with her existing worldview, and because she'd had no contrary information. The direct experience of humane treatment had shattered those beliefs and forced her to reconsider everything else she'd been taught. It was a lesson in epistemic humility, in recognizing how thoroughly propaganda can distort understanding when it controls information access. The women's POW facility near Munich operated from April 1945 through late 1946, processing thousands of female prisoners before closing. Records from the facility document no major incidents of abuse, no deaths except from pre-existing medical conditions, and generally successful adherence to Geneva Convention standards. Similar facilities across the American occupation zone maintained comparable records. This operational success wasn't automatic or easy. It required training, discipline, supervision, and institutional commitment to standards. American military police enforced regulations. Officers who failed to maintain proper POW treatment faced consequences. The system worked because the U.S. military prioritized making it work. The contrast with other theaters and other armies remained stark. In the Pacific, Japanese forces rarely took prisoners and often murdered those captured. Allied prisoners of Japan faced horrific conditions, forced labor, systematic abuse. Japanese POW camps had mortality rates above 25%. The cultural and ideological differences produced radically different treatment. On the Eastern Front, neither Germany nor the Soviet Union adhered to Geneva Convention standards for treatment of each other's prisoners. Both sides committed massive atrocities. The war in the East was explicitly framed as an ideological struggle for survival with no quarter given. Propaganda on both sides emphasized the enemy's subhuman nature and justified any treatment as necessary. The Western Front operated differently. Britain and America maintained POW standards for captured Germans. Germany generally maintained reasonable standards for captured Western Allied personnel, motivated partly by reciprocity and partly by racism that viewed Western soldiers as worthy of better treatment than Soviets. This mutual adherence to at least minimal standards reduced atrocities significantly compared to the Eastern Front. The Korean War, starting just 5 years after World War II ended, demonstrated that American POW standards could persist across conflicts. U.S. forces continued following Geneva Convention guidelines, even when facing an enemy that often didn't reciprocate. The institutional commitment to regulated warfare survived beyond the specific context of fighting Nazi Germany. For the women who'd been in Greta's group that April day in 1945, the trajectories varied. Some embraced post-war democracy and became advocates for international law and human rights. Others withdrew into private life and rarely discussed their experiences. A few became defensive, minimizing Nazi crimes and romanticizing the Reich, but most, like Greta, spent years processing complex feelings of guilt, gratitude, shame, and recognition. The cognitive dissonance they'd experienced during that medical screening became a metaphor for Germany's broader post-war reckoning. Propaganda had taught one reality. Direct experience revealed another. The gap between expectation and actuality forced confrontation with uncomfortable truths. For individuals, this meant personal moral crisis. For the nation, it meant decades of difficult historical accounting. Greta lived until 1998, dying at age 80 in a unified Germany she'd never expected to see. In private conversations with family late in life, she occasionally discussed her war experiences. She described the terror of Soviet advance, the chaos of retreat, the the desperate flight westward. She described the moment of surrender to American forces and the confusion that followed. Most memorably, she described that moment in April 1945 when Lieutenant Mitchell ordered her to undress for medical examination. She described the absolute certainty that horror was about to begin, the decision to sacrifice herself for others, the trembling walk to the medical tent, and then the anticlimax of professional medical procedure, the confusion of humane treatment, the slow realization that everything she'd believed about the enemy was wrong. That moment, she said, taught her more about civilization and barbarism than years of Nazi education ever had. The Americans weren't superior because they won the war. They were superior because they maintained moral standards while winning. They proved that democracy could be strong without being monstrous, that military power could coexist with civilized behavior, that ideological confidence didn't require abandoning basic humanity. The lesson extended beyond military conduct. In the decades after the war, as Germany rebuilt and democratized, the model of law-governed behavior became central to the Federal Republic's identity. Germany embraced international law, human rights conventions, multilateral institutions, and democratic governance partly because the alternative had been so catastrophic. The example of Allied restraint during occupation demonstrated that power could be exercised through law rather than only through force. For Greta, personally, the experience of expecting Soviet-style treatment and receiving American-style treatment became a foundational memory. It represented the moment propaganda collapsed and reality intruded. It forced recognition that she'd served the wrong side in a moral conflict. It began a painful process of understanding and accepting Germany's responsibility for Nazi atrocities. The undressing order that had seemed like the beginning of violation was actually the first moment of dignity she'd experienced in months. The American nurses who'd conducted that clinical professional medical examination had been doing their jobs according to regulations. They'd been maintaining standards even when dealing with enemy prisoners. They'd been proving through mundane professional competence that their civilization was worth defending. That proof mattered. Wars are won through military force, but legitimacy comes from moral authority. The Americans won World War II decisively, but they also demonstrated throughout the conflict that they represented something worth defending. Treatment of POWs was just one small aspect, but it was an aspect that thousands of German prisoners experienced directly. For many, like Greta, it was the first crack in propaganda's grip. The broader historical context of POW treatment in World War II reveals stark contrasts. The war saw approximately 11 million prisoners taken by various combatants. Mortality rates varied enormously depending on who held prisoners. Western Allied prisoners in German camps faced approximately 4% mortality, harsh but not deliberately murderous. Soviet prisoners in German camps faced 57% mortality, the result of deliberate policy to let them die. German prisoners in Soviet camps faced 35% mortality, partly retaliation and partly the result of Soviet logistical chaos. German and Italian prisoners in Western Allied camps faced less than 1% mortality, the result of systematic adherence to Geneva Convention standards. These statistics weren't just numbers. Each percentage point represented tens of thousands of individual humans who either survived or died based on their captors' policies. The differential treatment demonstrated that choices mattered, that military and political leadership could either maintain standards or abandon them, and that abandoning standards had measurable consequences in human suffering. The United States chose to maintain standards despite knowing about enemy atrocities, despite public pressure for revenge, despite the difficulty and expense of properly housing and feeding hundreds of thousands of prisoners. That choice reflected American military culture, democratic governance, concern for reciprocity, and ideological commitment to proving moral superiority through action. For the women who experienced that choice firsthand in April 1945, standing terrified before American captors and then receiving professional treatment rather than brutality, the impact was profound. It wasn't just relief at survival. It was confrontation with cognitive dissonance so severe it forced ideological reevaluation. When propaganda and reality conflict so dramatically, rational people must revise their beliefs. That revision process was Germany's broader challenge in the post-war period. The entire nation had to confront the gap between Nazi propaganda and historical reality. Millions had to process the recognition that they'd supported or enabled monstrous crimes. The psychological difficulty of this reckoning cannot be overstated. Many Germans never fully accepted it, retreating into denial or deflection, but enough did accept it that Germany successfully transformed into a stable democracy. The Nuremberg trials and subsequent proceedings established legal accountability for Nazi crimes. Denazification programs attempted to remove Nazi influence from institutions. Educational reforms taught accurate history rather than propaganda. Democratic governance replaced authoritarian rule. The process was imperfect and incomplete, but Germany did fundamentally transform. That transformation was possible partly because Allied occupation demonstrated an alternative model. American, British, and French forces governed their zones according to law, allowed gradual return to German self-governance, invested in economic recovery through the Marshall Plan, and integrated West Germany into democratic Europe. The contrast with Soviet occupation of East Germany was instructive. Where Western allies promoted democracy, recovery occurred. Where Soviets imposed communism, stagnation followed. For individuals like Greta, these macro-historical processes played out through personal experience. She'd served a monstrous regime while believing propaganda that justified it. She'd been captured expecting atrocity and experienced restraint. She'd had to confront uncomfortable truths about the side she'd served and the enemies who'd defeated her. She'd rebuilt a life in a democratic Germany she initially found alien but gradually came to appreciate. The undressing order remained, throughout her life, the symbolic moment when everything changed. The terror of that moment never fully faded from memory, but it was coupled with recognition of what had actually followed, the cognitive whiplash between expectation and reality, propaganda and truth, barbarism and civilization. That moment taught her that surface appearances can deceive, that professional conduct matters, that institutions constrained by law and regulation behave differently from those operating without constraint. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, the American nurse who'd overseen that medical screening, never knew the full impact of her routine professional conduct. She processed thousands of German POWs during her service, conducted countless medical examinations, filled out endless forms, and enforced regulations she sometimes found tedious. For her, it was just the job. She was doing what training and regulations required, maintaining standards because that's what professional military medical personnel did. But for Greta and the other women in that group, Mitchell's professional competence was revelatory. It demonstrated that enemy soldiers could follow rules, maintain standards, and treat prisoners humanely, even in the chaos of total war's end. It proved that propaganda lies, that not all armies behave the same, that choices about conduct matter. Small acts of professional restraint, multiplied across millions of encounters, separated civilized from barbaric warfare. The lesson of April 1945, near Regensburg, was that civilization persists through institutional commitment to standards, even under pressure. The Americans who captured Greta's group weren't saints or heroes. They were tired soldiers doing their jobs according to regulations. But those regulations existed, were enforced, and shaped conduct in ways that made enormous difference to the prisoners experiencing them. That difference between receiving humane treatment and experiencing brutality represented the fundamental divide in World War II. On one side were forces fighting for systems governed by law, constrained by standards, accountable through democratic process. On the other side were forces fighting for authoritarian systems without constraint, where might made right and atrocity was policy. The Allies won militarily, but they also demonstrated daily through countless small interactions like medical screenings that their system was morally superior. For Germany, defeat meant not just military collapse, but moral reckoning. The nation had to confront crimes committed in its name, accept responsibility, and rebuild on different foundations. That process took generations and arguably continues today. But it was possible partly because victorious allies demonstrated through their conduct during occupation that alternative systems could work, that governance by law was possible, that democracy could deliver stability and prosperity. Greta's experience was one microscopic piece of this enormous historical process, but it was her piece, the moment that broke propaganda's grip and forced recognition of uncomfortable truths. The undressing order that terrified her, the medical examination she'd dreaded, the professional restraint she'd never expected, these became the catalyst for personal transformation that mirrored Germany's necessary national transformation. In the end, the lesson was about power and restraint. The Americans had the power to treat prisoners however they wished. They chose restraint, following international law and military regulations, even when it was inconvenient. That choice demonstrated civilization's strength. Barbarism is easy. Anyone can abandon moral standards when it's convenient. Maintaining those standards under pressure requires discipline, institutional commitment, and moral courage. The German women standing terrified in that POW facility in April 1945 expected barbarism because that's what propaganda taught, and some of them had witnessed on the Eastern Front. They received instead professional military procedure. That gap between expectation and experience, between propaganda and reality, between barbarism and civilization, was the lesson of the war itself. Some nations maintained standards, others abandoned them. The consequences of that choice shaped the post-war world and echo through history, even today. If this story of unexpected humanity amid the chaos of war opened your eyes to a lesser-known side of history, help us share these important historical lessons. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our deep dives into the untold stories of World War II and beyond. Give this video a thumbs up if you appreciated the detailed historical research and nuanced perspective we brought to this complex topic. Your likes help the algorithm show this content to more history enthusiasts who value factual, well-documented storytelling. Most importantly, we want to hear from you in the comments. What surprised you most about this story? Did you know about the stark differences in POW treatment between the Eastern and Western fronts? Share your thoughts, questions, and reflections below. Engaging conversations in the comments section help build our community of critical thinkers who appreciate history's complexity. And if you know someone who's interested in World War II history, military history, or the human psychology behind propaganda and belief systems, share this video with them. These stories matter, and spreading awareness of how nations conducted themselves under the extreme pressures of total war remains relevant today. Thank you for watching, for thinking critically about history, and for being part of a community that values documented facts over mythology. We'll see you in the next video, where we continue exploring the untold stories that shaped our world.